Welcome to 221B Baker Street.
Chapter 1. The uninvited lodger. The year was 1894, and a thick, unrelenting yellow fog had descended upon London, wrapping the city in a suffocating embrace. From the sitting-room window of 221A Baker Street, Dr. John Watson watched the gas lamps bleeding weakly into the gloom, looking like blurred, luminous ghosts in the dense vapor. The muffled sounds of horse hooves and the occasional shout of a bewildered cabman were the only signs of life in an otherwise paralyzed city. Inside, the atmosphere was scarcely more animated. For 3 days, Sherlock Holmes had been deprived of the one thing that fueled his restless intellect: a puzzle. Watson turned from the window to observe his friend. Holmes was curled up in his velvet armchair, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes half closed. A cold pipe hung precariously from his lips, and a scraping, discordant melody emanated from the violin resting carelessly across his lap. To the untrained eye, the great detective appeared to be slipping into a state of profound lethargy, but Watson knew better. Beneath that languid exterior, a formidable engine was racing, desperate for traction. "It is a peculiar thing, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence without him so much as opening an eye, "that a medical man of your experience should allow himself to be so thoroughly swindled by a street peddler." Watson started, his hand instinctively going to the inner pocket of his waistcoat. "Good heavens! Holmes, how could you possibly know about that? I have not breathed a word of it to a soul." Holmes finally opened his eyes, a faint, solitary gleam of amusement dancing in them. He set the violin aside and uncoiled his long limbs, stepping toward the fireplace to retrieve a burning coal with the tongs to light his pipe. "I am neither a sorcerer nor a telepath, my dear doctor," Holmes said, taking a deep draw and letting the blue smoke swirl toward the ceiling. "It is entirely a matter of observation and logical deduction. When you entered this morning, I noted a fresh, distinct scratch upon the gold casing of your pocket watch. Now, that watch is a cherished family heirloom, and you are notoriously fastidious with it. The scratch is jagged, suggesting it was hastily pried open with an improper tool." "But how does that lead to a swindler?" Watson asked, genuinely baffled. "Because," Holmes continued smoothly, "your left index finger bears a faint dark stain of inferior, sulfur-based polish, the sort sold by those aggressive hawkers near Charing Cross, who insist on demonstrating their wares on the personal effects of passers-by. You allowed him to polish your watch. He used a cheap abrasive tool, slipped, scratched the casing, and hastily handed it back. Your slightly foul mood upon arriving, and the fact that you immediately tucked the watch into an inner pocket rather than your usual waistcoat fob, told me you were deeply irritated by the encounter." Watson could only shake his head in reluctant admiration. "You are perfectly correct. It was a momentary lapse in judgment. The fellow was incredibly persistent." "It is human nature to yield to persistence, Watson," Holmes murmured, staring out at the fog. "But I fear we shall soon face a persistence of a far darker nature. The criminal classes of London have grown dreadfully unimaginative." "I would give a week's keep for a single compelling—" He was interrupted by a sudden, violent thumping from the stairs outside their door. It was not the measured tread of their landlady, Mrs. Hudson, nor the heavy, confident steps of a Scotland Yard inspector. It was a frantic, desperate scramble. Before Watson could move toward the door, it was thrown open with a crash. A man stood in the threshold, gasping for air as if he had run for miles. His appearance was wretched. A sodden Ulster coat clung to his trembling frame, and his fine leather boots were caked with Thames mud. He had lost his hat, and his dark, thinning hair was plastered against his pale, terrified face. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the man croaked, his wild eyes darting between the two men. "I am Holmes," the detective said, his voice entirely devoid of surprise, though Watson noted a sudden, predatory sharpness in his posture. "And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. You have the advantage of us, sir." The man stumbled forward, slamming the door behind him and throwing his weight against it, as if trying to bar entry to some invisible Pursuer. My name is Julian Vance. Mr. Holmes, I beg of you. You must grant me sanctuary. They are hunting me, and if they find me, I shall hang for a crime that is an absolute impossibility. Holmes's eyes sparkled with the immediate thrill of the chase. He gestured expansively toward the settee. Calm yourself, Mr. Vance. A hanging is a rather permanent inconvenience. Pray, sit down, warm yourself by the fire, and tell us exactly who is hunting you, and what impossible crime you have supposedly committed. Vance collapsed onto the settee, shivering violently. Watson quickly poured a generous measure of brandy from the tantalus and handed it to the trembling man. Vance swallowed it in one gulp, the colour returning slightly to his ashen cheeks. "It is Scotland Yard," Vance whispered, staring into the flickering flames. "Inspector Lestrade and a dozen constables are scouring the streets of Mayfair for me at this very moment. I evaded them only by ducking into a coal chute, and then running blindly through this infernal fog until I reached Baker Street." "And the charge?" Holmes inquired, leaning against the mantelpiece, his pipe held loosely in one hand. "Murder, Mr. Holmes. The murder of my employer, the Earl of Blackwood, and the theft of the Anubis sapphire." Watson gasped. The Earl of Blackwood was a well-known eccentric, a renowned collector of Egyptian antiquities and a man of immense wealth. "A formidable charge," Holmes observed, his tone dangerously calm. "And you maintain your innocence?" "Before God, I am innocent," Vance cried, his voice breaking. "I am or was his archivist. Last night, the Earl requested my presence in his private subterranean vault to catalogue newly arrived artifacts. The vault, Mr. Holmes, is a masterpiece of modern engineering. It possesses a single steel door secured by two separate locks. The Earl held one key, I held the other. The door can only be locked or unlocked by turning both keys simultaneously." Holmes' eyes narrowed, a sharp intensity replacing his earlier lethargy. "Continue." "We entered the vault at midnight," Vance said, his hands trembling as he gripped his knees. "The Earl secured the door behind us. We worked for an hour. The last thing I recall was examining a golden chalice. Then, a sudden, crushing blow to the back of my head. The world went black." Vance touched the back of his skull, wincing. Watson moved forward, his medical instincts taking over, and parted the man's damp hair. There, unmistakable and ugly, was a severe contusion and a laceration that had bled freely. "He tells the truth about the blow, Holmes," Watson confirmed. "A heavy, blunt instrument, wielded with considerable force." "I awoke hours later," Vance continued, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. The gas lamps were still hissing. My head pounded. I dragged myself up and I found the Earl. He lay in the center of the room, a ceremonial dagger driven entirely through his chest. The pedestal where the Anubis sapphire rested was empty, and Vance choked on a sob. My hands were covered in his blood. My key was still in my pocket. The Earl's key was still in his. And the heavy steel door, Mr. Holmes, was locked from the outside. Holmes finished quietly, his eyes burning with an intense, icy fire. "Yes," Vance cried out, "locked. But how could the murderer strike me down, stab the Earl, take the jewel, exit the vault, and lock a door that requires two keys from the outside, when both keys remained inside with us?" Silence stretched across the sitting room of 221 Baker Street, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, muffled sounds of the foggy city. Holmes took a long, slow draw from his pipe. The fog of lethargy had completely vanished from his sharp features, replaced by the calculating brilliance that Watson knew so well. "You shall be our guest, Mr. Vance," Holmes said finally, a terrible, thrilling energy radiating from his lean frame. "Watson, lock the street door and tell Mrs. Hudson we are receiving no official visitors from the yard. It appears the criminal classes have decided to test my wits, after all." Chapter 2. The Inspector's Theory. It was nearing noon before the dense, Mustard-colored fog began to thin, revealing the soot-stained bricks of the houses opposite our window. Within the confines of our sitting room, however, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable electric tension. Our uninvited lodger, Julian Vance, had succumbed to an exhausted slumber upon my own bed, having been heavily dosed with a sedative I deemed absolutely necessary for his shattered nerves. Sherlock Holmes, meanwhile, was a man transformed. The lethargic creature of the morning was entirely gone, replaced by a hound who had caught a fresh scent. He stood by the window, examining Vance's muddied ulster coat and leather boots with the aid of his silver-rimmed magnifying glass. "Well, Watson?" Holmes asked, without turning around. "What do you make of our fugitive?" "Clinically speaking, the man is terrified," I replied, settling into my armchair. "The contusion on his occipital bone is severe. He could not possibly have inflicted such a blow upon himself, with that degree of force which lends credence to his tale of a third party within that vault." "Excellent, Watson," Holmes murmured, scraping a bit of dried mud from the heel of Vance's boot into a small glass vial. "But the presence of a wound merely proves he was struck, not that he is innocent of the Earl's murder. We must maintain a strict objectivity. However, this mud is decidedly interesting. It contains traces of crushed red brick and a peculiar white ash, distinctly characteristic of the construction sites near the new underground railway extension in Mayfair, directly adjacent to the late Earl of Blackwood's estate. Vance's story of his flight holds true." A sudden, sharp rap at the street door downstairs interrupted our discourse. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, and a moment later the door to our sitting room was pushed open to reveal the ferret-like features of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. His bowler hat was pushed back on his head, and he wore a triumphant, albeit weary, smirk. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade announced, striding into the room and warming his hands by the fire. "A foul day, but a highly successful one for the Yard, I am pleased to say." Holmes lazily dropped the magnifying glass into his pocket and threw himself onto the settee, instantly feigning a yawn. "Success, Lestrade. You astonish me. I was under the impression the criminal intellect of London had gone on holiday." "Not this time, Holmes," Lestrade chuckled, oblivious to the fact that the very man he sought was snoring softly mere yards away in the next room. "We have a most straightforward case of murder and robbery at the residence of the Earl of Blackwood. A tragic business, truly. The Earl was found stabbed through the heart in his subterranean vault, and the famous Anubis sapphire is missing." "And you have the culprit?" I asked, attempting to keep my voice perfectly level. "We have his identity, Doctor," Lestrade said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The Earl's archivist, a fellow named Julian Vance. It is an open and shut case. The two men went into the vault late last night. This morning, the housekeeper found the outer grate open, but the heavy steel door locked. We had to summon a locksmith with heavy drills to bypass the double-cylinder mechanism. Inside, we found the Earl dead and Vance completely vanished, along with the jewel." Holmes steepled, his long, thin fingers together. "Vanished, you say? But if the steel door was locked from the outside, and it requires two separate keys to operate the mechanism simultaneously, as the Earl was known to boast, how did your murderer lock the door behind him and flee?" Lestrade waved his hand impatiently. "A trivial detail, Holmes. Vance must have had a confederate on the outside, a fellow who possessed a duplicate set of keys. They locked the door to delay discovery, while Vance escaped through some hidden ventilation shaft or secret passage we have yet to uncover. We are pulling the walls apart as we speak. A duplicate set of keys to a bespoke double-cylinder lock." Holmes raised a single, skeptical eyebrow. "A mechanism specifically designed to be unpickable and unduplicable without the original molds, which are kept securely at the Bank of England. Your confederate must be a master of metallurgy, Lestrade." Lestrade's smirk faltered slightly, but his stubborn pride quickly reasserted itself. You always overcomplicate things, Holmes. The man was in the room. The man is now gone. The jewel is gone. Therefore, the man took the jewel. I merely came by to ask if you had seen any suspicious characters matching Vance's description lurking about Baker Street. We have reports he was seen fleeing in this direction. I assure you, Lestrade, Holmes replied smoothly. No one matching the description of a murderous jewel-thieving archivist with a phantom accomplice has troubled our threshold today. Lestrade grunted in satisfaction. Very well, if you hear anything, send word to the yard. As soon as the inspector's heavy footsteps faded down the stairs and the front door slammed shut, Holmes sprang from the settee with electrifying swiftness. Quickly, Watson. Your hat and boots, he commanded, his eyes flashing with a brilliant, predatory light. Lestrade is a good hound, but he is chasing a phantom fox while destroying the very ground the real scent rests upon. If they are tearing the vault apart, we have no time to lose. We are going to Mayfair, I asked, grabbing my bowler and a heavy walking stick from the stand. We are going to examine an impossible room, Watson, Holmes said, donning his deerstalker. A room where a man was bludgeoned, another murdered, a priceless sapphire stolen, and the only exit securely locked by the very victims themselves. The game is afoot. Chapter 3. The Sanctuary of Shadows, the drive to Mayfair, was conducted in a silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of our hansom's wheels against the damp cobblestones. Holmes sat huddled in his corner, his chin sunk upon his chest, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the air. I knew better than to disturb him when his mind was weaving the disparate threads of a case into a coherent pattern. The fog had thinned too, a ghostly grey veil revealing the stark, imposing facades of the aristocratic mansions that lined the squares of London's most exclusive district. Blackwood Manor was a sprawling, sombre edifice of soot-stained limestone, its windows like sightless eyes looking out over a small, iron-fenced park. A cluster of constables stood by the entrance, their oilskins gleaming in the damp. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes murmured, as we stepped from the carriage. "Lestrade's men are like terriers. They have a scent, but they lack the imagination to see the tiger behind the bush." We were met at the door not by a policeman, but by a young man of striking appearance. He was tall and slender, dressed in mourning black that seemed to swallow the dim light of the foyer. His face was a mask of pale composure, though his eyes, dark and restless, betrayed a deep-seated agitation. "Mr. Holmes, I am Percival St. Clair, the late Earl's nephew," he said, his voice clipped and precise. "Inspector Lestrade informed me you might arrive. He is currently in the library, attempting to make sense of my uncle's ledgers. I trust you are here to confirm the guilt of that wretched archivist." "I am here to confirm the truth, Mr. Sinclair," Holmes replied coolly, his gaze sweeping over the young man with a clinical intensity. "The two are not always synonymous. I understand you were not present when the tragedy occurred." "I was at my club until 2 in the morning," Percival replied, a touch of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "The servants can attest to my return. My uncle was a difficult man, obsessed with his relics. He trusted no one but Vance with the keys to the vault." "Indeed. And where is this vault?" Percival gestured toward a heavy oak door at the rear of the hall. "Beneath the servants' quarters. It was my uncle's pride, and, it seems, his tomb." We descended a narrow stone staircase that smelled of damp earth and ancient dust. At the bottom lay a short corridor ending in a massive steel door, now standing ajar, the heavy scent of iron, and something more metallic. The copper tang of blood hung heavy in the air. Inside, the vault was a marvel of Victorian engineering. The walls were lined with reinforced steel plates, and the floor was a solid slab of polished granite. Placed on velvet-lined pedestals were various Egyptian artifacts, canopic jars, golden amulets, and a half-finished sarcophagus. In the center of the room, Lord Blackwood lay where he had fallen. He, when I be send, was a stout man, his silver hair matted with gore. A long, ornate dagger with a hilt shaped like a jackal's head remained buried deep in his chest. A few feet away, a pedestal stood empty, the former resting place of the Anubis sapphire. Holmes did not look at the body first. Instead, he dropped to his hands and knees, crawling across the granite floor with the grace of a hunting cat. He examined the area around the door, then moved toward the empty pedestal. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, pointing to a faint, jagged scratch on the side of the steel door's interior frame. "The metal is gouged, and here, on the floor, a tiny fragment of—" "What do you make of this?" He held up a microscopic shard of something translucent. I peered at it through his glass. "It looks like a sliver of common glass, Holmes, or perhaps crystal. Too thick for a lamp chimney, too curved for a window pane," Holmes muttered, dropping it into a pillbox. He then turned his attention to the door mechanism. The two keyholes were situated 6 inches apart. He produced a set of delicate probes from his pocket and began to manipulate the tumblers. "Lestrade believes a confederate locked the door from the outside," I remarked. "But, as you said, the keys are unique." "Lestrade's theory requires a miracle of locksmithing," Holmes said, standing up and dusting his knees. "Look at the dust on the hinges, Watson. It is undisturbed. If this door had been opened and closed more than once last night, the fine layer of limestone dust from the ceiling, a result of the nearby railway vibrations, would show clear striations. It does not. Then how did the killer leave?" Holmes ignored the question, his eyes suddenly fixing on the ceiling. He dragged a heavy wooden crate toward the center of the room and climbed atop it. "A ventilation shaft," I suggested, looking up at a small, iron-grated square high on the wall. "Too small for a man, barely large enough for a well-fed rat," Holmes said, poking his probe. Through the grate, he pulled it back and sniffed the tip. A strange expression crossed his face, a mixture of triumph and profound confusion. "Almonds, Watson. Do you smell it?" "Cyanide," I gasped. No, not the bitter almond of poison. This is sweet. Marzipan, perhaps, or a specific type of French confectionery paste." He hopped down, his eyes blazing. "Mr. St. Clair," he called out. The nephew appeared in the doorway, looking nervous. "Yes? Was your uncle in the habit of eating sweets in his vault?" Percival blinked, clearly caught off guard. He loathed sugar. He was a diabetic, Mr. Holmes. He touched nothing of the sort." "Why do you ask?" "A mere whim," Holmes replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. He walked over to the body of the Earl and knelt briefly, not to examine the wound, but to look at the man's fingernails. He then stood up abruptly. "We have seen enough for now. Watson, we must visit the local bakeries and perhaps a certain clockmaker in the Strand." "Oh, but the murder, Holmes," I protested. "The dagger, the locked door." "The door was locked, Watson, because the person who locked it never intended to leave," Holmes said enigmatically as we climbed back toward the daylight. "The problem is not how the murderer got out, but rather why he chose such an elaborate way to stay in." As we left the manor, I caught a glimpse of Percival St. Clair watching us from an upper window. His expression was no longer one of grief, but of a cold, calculating curiosity that sent a shiver down my spine. The mystery of the Anubis sapphire had only just begun to bleed its dark secrets. Chapter 4. The clockmaker's ledger, the gas lamps of the Strand, were already being lit against the gathering dusk as our hansom clattered to a halt outside a narrow, dust-streaked shop front. The sign above the door, painted in fading gold leaf, read J. Vogel, Phorologist and Precision Instruments. Throughout our journey from Mayfair, Holmes had maintained a cryptic silence, his fingers drumming a restless, rhythmic tattoo against his knees. "The glass, Holmes," I ventured as we stepped onto the pavement. "You believe it to be a piece of a watch?" "Not a watch, Watson," he replied, his eyes scanning the bustling street. "The curvature is too pronounced, the thickness too substantial. It is the protective fascia of a robust industrial mechanism. Unless the Earl was in the habit of keeping a steam engine in his vault, The shard is utterly foreign to the scene. Come, let us see if my suspicions bear fruit. We entered the shop, instantly enveloped in a symphony of ticking. Clocks of every conceivable shape and size crowded the shelves, their brass pendulums swinging in a hypnotic, disjointed rhythm. From the back room emerged Herr Vogel, a small, stooped man with a jeweler's loop permanently wedged into his right eye socket. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Vogel exclaimed, a wide smile breaking through his bristling white beard. "It is an honor. How may I be of service to the great detective?" Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries. He withdrew the small pill-box from his pocket and tipped the microscopic shard of glass onto the glass-topped counter. "I require your expertise, Vogel. Tell me, from what specific instrument does this convex splinter originate?" The clockmaker adjusted his loop and leaned close, turning the shard with a pair of delicate silver tweezers. He hummed thoughtfully, "Ah, German borosilicate glass, highly specialized. You see this faint bevel on the edge, Mr. Holmes? This is not from a standard timepiece. This is the casing of a pneumatic delay timer, a mechanism used primarily in modern bank vaults to engage secondary locking bolts after a specified interval." Holmes's eyes flashed triumphantly. "A delay timer, and do you stock such items?" "Rarely," Vogel admitted. "There is little demand. However, I did sell one precisely 3 weeks ago." "To whom?" I asked, eagerly, feeling the thrill of the chase. "A gentleman who paid handsomely in cash," Vogel replied, opening a heavy, leather-bound ledger. "He did not give a name, but I recall him vividly. A tall man, sporting a thick auburn beard and dark spectacles. He had a peculiar, lingering scent about him, sweet, like almonds or, yes, like marzipan." Holmes slammed his hand onto the counter, causing a dozen delicate timepieces to chime in protest. "Brilliant, Vogel. You have been of inestimable help. Watson, the game is not merely afoot, it is sprinting toward a most extraordinary conclusion." We burst back out into the cool evening air. Holmes's mood was electric. "Do you see it now, Watson? The impossible locked door is impossible no longer. The murderer did not lock the door as he fled. He set a pneumatic timer to throw the secondary bolts after he had safely exited, utilizing the very mechanism the Earl boasted was impenetrable." "But who is the man with the auburn beard?" I asked, as we hailed another cab. "Could it be Vance in a disguise?" "Vance is a terrified archivist with a cracked skull, not a mechanical engineer," Holmes retorted, settling into the carriage. "No, Watson, the plot is far more intricate. We must return to Baker Street. I suspect we shall have news waiting for us." Holmes's prediction proved entirely accurate. Upon ascending the stairs to our sitting room, we found a crumpled telegram resting upon the silver tray on the table. Holmes tore it open, his eyes scanning the brief message before a deep, rumbling laugh escaped his lips. "Read it, Watson," he said, tossing the paper to me. The message was brief and triumphant. Case closed. Percival St. Clair arrested for murder and theft. Motive established. Confederate sought. "Ferndi Lestrade, St. Clair," I gasped, dropping the telegram. "The nephew. Well, it makes a certain sense, Holmes. He lives in the house, he knew of the vault, and his manner was exceedingly cold." "And the motive?" Holmes prompted, lighting his pipe. "Money, presumably. If the Earl was an eccentric who spent his fortune on antiquities, perhaps the nephew grew impatient for his inheritance. Lestrade must have uncovered a financial embarrassment." "Oh, he has undoubtedly uncovered something," Holmes said, pacing the room in a cloud of blue smoke. "Scotland Yard is excellent at discovering the obvious. Let us assume Lestrade found gambling debts a classic, uninspired motive. St. Clair needs money. He waits until Vance and the Earl are in the vault. He strikes Vance, kills his uncle, takes the Anubis sapphire, and flees. A perfectly logical sequence of events to a man of Lestrade's pedestrian imagination." "But you disagree," I noted. recognizing the disdain in my friend's voice. "It is too perfect, Watson," Holmes cried, turning to face me. "It fits the mold of a cheap penny dreadful. Why would a desperate debt-ridden aristocrat devise a brilliant, highly technical pneumatic locking mechanism to frame a lowly archivist? Why would he wear a false auburn, beard and smell of French confectionery to purchase the timer weeks in advance? The methods contradict the character of the suspect entirely." Holmes walked to the window, staring out into the gas-lit street. "No, Watson, Lestrade has merely arrested the scapegoat. The true architect of this crime is still out there, clutching the Anubis sapphire and laughing at the profound stupidity of the official police. But he has made one fatal error. He has introduced a mechanical certainty into a human equation, and in doing so, he has given me the thread I need to unravel his entire tapestry." Chapter 5. The Sweet Scent of Deceit. The following morning, I was violently awakened by an odor so cloying and pungent that it seemed to coat the very back of my throat. Having taken up temporary residence on the sitting-room sofa to afford Julian Vance the sanctuary of my bedroom, I threw off my blankets and sat up, coughing into my fist. The sitting-room was filled with a hazy, bluish smoke. Through the veil of fumes, I perceived Sherlock Holmes hunched over his makeshift chemical bench. He had pushed aside his usual racks of test tubes and acid carboys, replacing them with a portable Bunsen burner and a heavy iron crucible. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I choked, throwing open the nearest window to admit the damp morning air. "Are you attempting to asphyxiate us? It smells as though a French bakery has caught fire in our parlor." "My apologies, my dear Watson," Holmes replied, entirely unbothered by the noxious atmosphere. He used a pair of heavy iron tongs to lift the crucible from the flame. "I assure you, the olfactory assault is a necessary sacrifice upon the altar of truth. Come here and observe." I tied my dressing gown and approached. Inside the crucible bubbled a thick, viscous paste of a pale, yellowish hue, a rather rudimentary mixture of pulverized almonds, crystallized sugar, and a binding agent, Holmes explained, his eyes gleaming with that familiar manic intensity. "In short, Watson, marzipan, or rather a confectioner's putty of a very similar composition." He retrieved a spare brass key from his waistcoat pocket and pressed it firmly into a shallow wooden tray filled with a cooling lump of the same paste. After a moment, he deftly removed the key, leaving behind a perfectly rigid, highly detailed impression of the wards and cuts. "Do you see it now, Watson?" he asked, waving a hand over the mold. Herr Vogel, the clockmaker, noted the distinct scent of this confection upon our mysterious purchaser of the pneumatic timer. A man does not smell so strongly of marzipan merely from indulging in a sweetmeat. But if he had spent the prior evening meticulously mixing a batch of this rapidly hardening paste to take a surreptitious mold of a highly complex double-cylinder lock. "The Earl's key," I exclaimed, the sheer brilliance of the deduction dawning upon me. "He used the paste to take an impression, and from that cast a duplicate." Precisely," Holmes said, wiping his hands upon a rag. "It bypasses the necessity of stealing the original molds from the Bank of England. But it presents a singular difficulty, Watson. The Earl kept his key on his person at all times, secured to a heavy gold watch chain. Who could possess the physical proximity to take such an impression without arousing suspicion?" Before I could hazard a guess, a heavy tread upon the stairs heralded the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. He entered without, knocking, his bowler hat tipped back, and a profoundly smug expression plastered across his ferret-like features. "Still playing with your chemistry set, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade chuckled, waving away the lingering smoke. "You really ought to take up a healthier hobby. I merely dropped by to inform you that the Blackwood case will be wrapped up before the week is out." "You astound me, Inspector," Holmes said dryly, turning his back to the detective to tidy his instruments. "I assume you have discovered the definitive proof of Mr. Percival St. Clair's guilt." "I have indeed," Lestrade declared, slapping a leather-bound notebook against his palm. We searched the young master's chambers. Tucked beneath his floorboards, we found a ledger of debts. The man owes upward of £5,000 to a rather ruthless gambling syndicate in Newmarket. He was facing total ruin. The motive is as clear as the glass in your window. A desperate aristocrat, I murmured. It is a tale as old as London itself. Exactly, Doctor, Lestrade agreed. He knew the archivist and his uncle would be in the vault. He hired accomplices to fashion a mechanism to lock the door, murdered his uncle, stole the sapphire, and intended to fence it to clear his debts. Holmes sighed. A long, dramatic sound of profound disappointment. And the Anubis sapphire, Lestrade. Have you recovered it? Not yet, Lestrade admitted, but we are searching the usual pawnbrokers. You will not find it, Holmes said, leaning against the mantelpiece, because the murderer is likely discovering, at this very moment, that he has risked the gallows for a worthless bauble. Lestrade frowned. Worthless? The Anubis sapphire is valued at £20,000. It was valued at 20,000, Holmes corrected sharply, until I sent a telegram this morning to Mr. Endicott, the Earl's solicitor. He confirmed a suspicion of mine. The Earl was a paranoid man. The sapphire on display in the vault was a masterful piece of Bristol glass, a decoy. The true jewel was kept in a safe deposit box at the Bank of England. The murderer staged an impossible crime, slaughtered an old man, and stole a piece of blue glass. Lestrade stared at Holmes, his smugness evaporating into a mask of utter bewilderment. A fake. But if that is true, St. Clair will realize it cannot pay his debts. Suddenly, the sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering glass erupted from the floor below, echoing violently from the direction of my own bedroom, where Julian Vance had been resting. Holmes was in motion before the final shard hit the floor. He drew his revolver from his desk drawer in a single, fluid motion and bounded out the door, with me close on his heels and Lestrade fumbling for his whistle. We burst into my bedroom. The window, overlooking the street, had been smashed inward. A cold wind whipped the curtains. On the floor, shivering in terror beneath the overturned bed frame, was Julian Vance. Driven deep into the mahogany headboard, precisely where a man's skull would have rested had he been lying upon the pillows, was a heavy, wicked-looking throwing knife. Good God! I cried, rushing to Vance's side to ensure he was unharmed. Holmes strode to the window, peering cautiously out into the foggy street, his revolver raised. After a moment, he lowered the weapon and pulled the heavy knife from the wood with a sharp yank. It seems, Lestrade, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper, that our auburn-bearded friend has realized his sapphire is fake, and that the archivist he attempted to frame is still breathing. But how could the killer possibly know Vance was here? Lestrade stammered, staring at the wicked blade. A grim, terrifying smile played upon Holmes's lips. Because, Inspector, 2 hours ago, I sent a messenger to Blackwood Manor, loudly proclaiming to the household staff that I had secured the fugitive Julian Vance at 221 Baker Street. I laid a trap in the dark, and the tiger has finally bared its teeth. Chapter 6, The Assassin's Token. A trap, Holmes, I cried, my heart hammering against my ribs as I knelt beside the trembling Julian Vance. You deliberately invited a murderer to Baker Street. I invited a reaction, Watson, and I have received one of a most illuminating nature, Holmes replied, his eyes fixed upon the heavy knife in his hand. He held the weapon up to the light of the gas jet, his sharp features illuminated by its cold gleam. Observe the balance of the blade, the slight curvature, and the handle bound in tightly woven leather. This is no common street-pad's shank. It is a throwing knife of Moorish design, weighted perfectly for flight. A specialized tool for a highly specialized practitioner. Lestrade, who had finally recovered his voice, stared at the shattered window panes. He must have been standing on the pavement opposite, waiting for a clear silhouette against the curtain. The audacity of the scoundrel, wrong on both. Counts, I fear, Inspector, Holmes said calmly, tossing the knife onto the dressing table with a clatter. Firstly, the curtains were drawn tight. There was no silhouette. The assassin simply knew the layout of a standard Baker Street bedroom and aimed for the headboard. Secondly, he was not standing upon the pavement. Come, Watson, quickly, the scent is fresh. Without waiting for a reply, Holmes dashed from the room and bounded down the 17 steps to the front door, leaving Lestrade to guard our terrified lodger. I snatched up my heavy walking stick and hurried after my friend, stepping out into the damp, chilling night air. The street was mostly deserted, the gas lamps fighting a losing battle against the encroaching gloom. Holmes was already on his hands and knees across the street, illuminating the cobblestones with the brilliant beam of his dark lantern. "Look here, Watson," he commanded, pointing to a pair of deep, parallel grooves in the mud near the opposite curb. Our house, four-wheeler, has been waiting here. Notice the uneven, staggering tread of the near side rear wheel. A loose spoke, undoubtedly, but more importantly, observe the point of origin for our deadly projectile. I followed the beam of his lantern. On the edge of the curb, directly adjacent to the carriage tracks, lay a small, crushed cigar end and a distinct footprint. But what caught my eye was a scattering of white, chalky ash. The trajectory of the knife, buried deep in your mahogany headboard, dictated a downward angle of entry, Holmes explained, rising to his feet and brushing the dirt from his knees. The thrower could not have been standing on the street. He was standing atop the roof of his waiting cab, affording him the height necessary to hurl the blade with such devastating force through a first-floor window. "And the ash?" I asked, peering at the white powder. "Ah, the ash is the final beautiful piece of our puzzle," Holmes said, a note of pure triumph vibrating in his voice. "Do you recall the mud scraped from Mr. Vance's boots yesterday morning? Crushed red brick and white limestone ash. The identical compound is right here at our feet. And where did I say such a specific mixture originates?" "The Underground Railway extension in Mayfair," I exclaimed, "directly adjacent to the Earl of Blackwood's estate." "Precisely, Watson." Holmes clapped me upon the shoulder. Lestrade scoffed at the idea of a secret passage, but why build a passage when the city of London is excavating a massive tunnel directly beneath the manor's foundations? Our assassin, the man with the auburn beard and the sweet scent of marzipan, used the railway construction site to bypass the estate's external security. We rushed back upstairs to the sitting room. Lestrade was pacing the floor, looking thoroughly agitated, while Vance remained huddled in a chair by the fire. "Did you catch sight of him?" Lestrade demanded as we entered. "We caught sight of his methods, Inspector, which is infinitely more valuable," Holmes replied. He strode directly toward his own bedroom door. "Lestrade, I require you to return to the yard immediately. Issue a warrant for a four-wheeled cab with a loose near-side rear spoke. It will likely be found abandoned near the Mayfair excavations." "And what of you, Holmes?" Lestrade asked, narrowing his eyes. "I have a sudden and overpowering desire to join the working classes," Holmes called out, his voice already muffled behind his closed door. 10 minutes later, the door reopened, and I could scarcely believe my eyes. The elegant, immaculate detective had vanished entirely. In his place stood a rough, stoop-shouldered navvy. He wore a pair of corduroy trousers tied at the knees with string, a filthy flannel shirt, and a battered cloth cap pulled low over a face that had been masterfully darkened with soot and grease. He even carried a heavy iron wrench in one calloused, dirt-stained hand. "Good heavens," I gasped. "A reasonable likeness, I hope, Watson," Holmes rasped, his voice adopting a coarse, guttural East End accent. "I am off to the subterranean depths of Mayfair to find our elusive engineer. The man who cast the key, purchased the timer, and threw the knife is hiding among the labourers. He holds the key to this entire charade, and I intend to extract it from him." "Let me come with you," I insisted, gripping my stick tighter. "It is far too dangerous to confront such a man alone in the dark." "No, Watson, You must remain here, Holmes said, reverting to his normal, commanding tone. Vance is the only innocent man who can testify to the events inside that vault. Guard him with your life. Keep your revolver loaded and the door bolted. If I do not return by dawn, take our guest directly to Scotland Yard, and trust no one but Lestrade himself. With a final, solemn nod, the rough-hewn labourer turned and slipped out into the London night, descending into the very belly of the beast to hunt her. Phantom Chapter 7, The Architect of Shadows, the hours that followed Holmes's departure into the foggy abyss of London were among the most agonizing I have ever endured. Left alone in our Baker Street sitting room with a terrified fugitive and a shattered window, the familiar comforts of our lodgings felt entirely alien. I had nailed a heavy woolen blanket over the broken panes, but it did little to keep out the damp, creeping chill of the Thames, nor did it muffle the distant, melancholy wail of a passing riverboat. I sat in my armchair, the fire burning low in the grate, a loaded Webley Service revolver resting heavy and reassuring upon my knee. Opposite me, Julian Vance remained huddled on the sofa. The sedative had long since worn off, leaving the poor archivist in a state of high, vibrating anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of a passing hansom cab, caused him to flinch, as if the Moorish throwing knife were once again whistling toward his skull. To distract both him and myself from the suffocating tension, I poured us each a stiff measure of brandy. "Drink this, Mr. Vance," I commanded gently, handing him the glass. "It will steady your nerves. Holmes is on the scent, and there is no man in England better equipped to navigate the dark underbelly of this city." Vance took the glass with trembling hands, the crystal clinking frantically against his teeth as he drank. "You do not understand, Doctor. The man who orchestrated this, he is a phantom. To bypass that lock, to slip away like smoke, he is not a mere thief. He is an engineer of death." "An engineer," I repeated, the words striking a sudden resonant chord in my memory. I leaned forward, gripping the arms of my chair. "Mr. Vance, Holmes and I have deduced that the lock was not bypassed by magic, but by mechanics. A pneumatic timer was used to secure the bolts after the killer's exit. But to design such a device, the culprit must have had intimate knowledge of the vault's dimensions, the precise weight of the door, and the mechanics of the lock itself. Think back. Did any stranger have access to that vault in the weeks preceding the murder?" Vance blinked, his brow furrowing, as he waded through his trauma-fogged memory. "No, the Earl was fiercely protective. He allowed no one but myself." "Wait." He sat up slightly, a spark of realization lighting his pale eyes. "There was the structural survey." "A survey?" I urged, my heart beating a rapid tattoo against my ribs. "Yes. Exactly a month ago," Vance explained, his voice gaining strength. "The Underground Railway Company had begun blasting beneath Mayfair. The Earl was apoplectic with rage, terrified that the vibrations would compromise the reinforced walls of his sanctuary. He threatened a massive injunction against the city. To placate him, the railway foreman sent a civil engineer to conduct a thorough inspection of the vault's foundations and the integrity of the door frame. Good heavens, I breathed. "And this engineer, can you describe him?" "He was a taciturn fellow, spoke with a slight continental accent, perhaps German or Swiss," Vance recalled, rubbing his temples. "He wore heavy, dark spectacles to protect his eyes from the dust. And, yes, he sported a remarkably thick auburn beard." The final pieces of the puzzle crashed into place with the force of a falling portcullis. "The purchaser of the timer," I exclaimed. "He used the survey as a pretext to measure the door for the pneumatic device. But what of the key, Vance? How could he cast a mold of the Earl's key if it never left your employer's watch chain?" Vance's eyes widened in horror. "The deadbolts. To ensure the frame was aligned, the engineer requested that the door be locked and unlocked several times while he observed the mechanism. The Earl complained, but complied. At one point, the engineer dropped his measuring plumb. The Earl bent to retrieve it, his watch chain dangling. The engineer stood directly over him. Examining the lock cylinder with his hands, he could have easily pressed a lump of putty against the key in that brief distraction. "Brilliant, Vance. You have provided the very linchpin of the mystery," I declared, feeling a surge of triumph. Holmes's logic was entirely vindicated. The assassin, the clockmaker's customer, and the phantom engineer were one and the same. Before I could press him further, a sound froze the blood in my veins. It was not the downstairs door. It was a soft, stealthy scrape directly outside our sitting-room door. Mrs. Hudson had long since retired, and her step was heavy and pronounced. This was the calculated, weightless tread of a predator. I rose instantly, raising the Webley and leveling it at the heavy oak door. I gestured frantically for Vance to get behind the sofa. The archivist scrambled backward, whimpering softly. The brass handle of the door began to turn. It moved with an agonizing slowness, a millimeter at a time, whining faintly in the quiet. "Room, stand down," I barked, my voice ringing out with military authority. "I am armed, and I will not hesitate to fire through the wood." The handle snapped back. For a second there was dead silence. Then a frantic, desperate knocking erupted against the panels. "Dr. Watson, sir. Don't shoot. It's me," a shrill, youthful voice cried out. Frowning, I kept the revolver raised as I stepped forward and unbolted the door, pulling it open. Standing on the landing, dripping wet and covered in yellow mud from head to toe, was Simpson, one of the sharpest lads of Holmes's Baker Street irregulars. He was gasping for breath, his eyes wide with urgency in his soot-stained face. "Simpson, what in heaven's name—" "Mr. Holmes sent me—" "Doctor," the boy interrupted, thrusting a crumpled, heavily soiled piece of paper into my hand. "Said I was to run like the devil himself, was on me heels. Said it was life or death, sir." I hastily unfolded the scrap of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Holmes's, though the strokes were jagged and rushed, utterly lacking his usual elegant precision. More alarming, however, were the unmistakable, rusty brown smudges of drying blood that smeared the edges of the note. I held it to the gaslight and read the frantic scrawl. "Watson, the tiger's lair is found, but the beast has teeth. I am pinned in the dark. Come immediately to the Mayfair excavation shaft at Berkeley Square. Bring Vance. He is the bait we require. Trust no police. 15 Holmes." I stared. At the blood-stained paper, a cold dread washing over me. Holmes was in grave danger, trapped beneath the earth with a ruthless killer. I shoved the Webley into my coat pocket and grabbed my heavy walking stick. "Get your coat, Vance," I ordered grimly, tossing the man his muddied ulster. "Our vigil is over. We are going into the tunnels." Muddy Sea Door. Chapter 8. The labyrinth of Mayfair, the journey to Berkeley Square, was a descent into the very bowels of a nightmare. The fog had grown so dense and foul-smelling that our hansom cab was forced to crawl at a funeral pace, the horses' hooves clopping blindly against the damp cobblestones. Inside the cab, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Julian Vance sat opposite me, his face buried in his hands, trembling like a leaf in a winter gale. I held the crumpled, blood-stained note tightly in my fist, my mind churning with a violent tempest of doubt. Holmes's instructions prior to his departure had been absolute: keep your revolver loaded and the door bolted. Trust no one. Yet the handwriting on the note was undeniably his, even if the frantic strokes lacked their usual precision. Was it possible my friend had underestimated the ruthless cunning of the engineer? Had he been cornered in the subterranean darkness, left with no choice but to summon me, using Vance to draw the killer into the open? My military instincts, honed on the unforgiving plains of Afghanistan, screamed that we were walking into a snare. But the thought of Sherlock Holmes bleeding out in the dark, waiting for a rescue that would never come, overrode all caution. I checked a cylinder of my Webley revolver, the cold steel, providing a meager comfort. "We are here, Doctor," the cabman called out, his voice muffled by the yellow miasma. We alighted upon a desolate stretch of pavement. Berkeley Square was heavily barricaded with wooden fencing, marking the expansive construction site of the new underground railway. A gaping Stygian maw had been carved into the earth, ringed by heavy timber beams and towering iron cranes that looked like skeletal beasts in the fog. There were no watchmen, no flickering lanterns, only an oppressive, terrifying silence. "I cannot do this, Dr. Watson," Vance whispered, taking a terrified step backward. "It is a tomb. We are walking into our own tomb. Courage, man. Dahunda Safung," I hissed, grabbing him firmly by the shoulder of his ulster coat. "Holmes is down there, and he requires our aid. Stay close to my back, and make not a sound." I ignited my dark lantern, its narrow beam cutting a sharp path through the gloom, and led the way toward the wooden ladders that descended into the excavation shaft. The air grew instantly colder as we climbed downward, leaving the muffled sounds of the city behind. The scent of the earth was overpowering, a heavy, damp mixture of crushed red brick, wet clay, and chalky limestone ash. It was the exact composition of the mud upon Vance's boots, and the residue left by our rooftop assassin. We reached the floor of the tunnel, a wide, arched cavern shored up by massive timber supports. Water dripped relentlessly from the ceiling, echoing like a ticking clock in the vast emptiness. "Holmes," I called out, keeping my voice to a harsh whisper. "Holmes, it is Watson." Only the dripping water answered. We pressed deeper into the labyrinth. With every step, my unease multiplied. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded tools, nothing but endless, cavernous dark. And then a subtle change in the atmosphere made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. Beneath the smell of damp earth, a new scent had crept into the stagnant air. It was faint at first, but it grew steadily stronger, a sickly, sweet odor. "Almonds," I breathed, freezing in my tracks. "Marzipan." Before I could raise my revolver, the deafening crack of a gunshot shattered the silence. The dark lantern was violently ripped from my grasp, the glass shattering as the bullet extinguished the flame, plunging us into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Vance shrieked, dropping to the muddy floor. I threw myself against the rough timber wall, bringing the Webley up, my eyes straining blindly in the blackness. "A valiant effort, Dr. Watson, but ultimately foolish," a voice echoed through the tunnel. It was a cold, precise voice, carrying a distinct, clipped continental accent. A match flared 50 feet ahead of us, touching the wick of a bullseye lantern. As the light bloomed, it illuminated the figure of a tall, powerfully built man. He wore a heavy canvas coat, and his face was dominated by a pair of dark, wire-rimmed spectacles and a remarkably thick auburn beard. In his right hand, he leveled a long-barreled revolver directly at my chest. "The engineer," I growled, my finger tightening on the trigger. "A title I wear with pride," the man sneered, stepping slowly forward. "You possess a stubborn loyalty, Doctor. I calculated that a summons from your dear friend, suitably stained, with a few drops of blood from a stray dog, would overcome your natural caution." The irregular lad was quite easy to intercept and terrify into delivering my forgery. "Where is Holmes?" I demanded, refusing to lower my weapon. The bearded man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Mr. Holmes is currently wandering blindly through a collapsed ventilation shaft 3 miles toward Paddington. He is a clever hound, but he followed a false scent I laid explicitly for him. By the time he digs his way out, Mr. Vance will have suffered a tragic accident in the construction zone, and you, Doctor, will be framed for bringing him here to silence him." He cocked the hammer of his revolver, the metallic click echoing ominously. "Step away from the archivist, Watson. This does not have to be your grave as well." "I think not," I replied, bracing myself for the fatal exchange of gunfire. But before either of us could squeeze the trigger, a shadow detached itself from the timber scaffolding directly above the engineer. A figure in a filthy flannel shirt, and corduroy trousers dropped with the silent, deadly grace of a panther. A heavy iron wrench swung through the air, striking the engineer's gun hand with a sickening crunch. The man roared in pain, his weapon clattering to the muddy floor, discharging a wild shot into the tunnel roof. "Your calculations, my dear engineer," rasped the soot-stained navvy as he stood over the disarmed killer, his eyes burning with a familiar, brilliant fire, failed to account for the fact that I never went to Paddington at all. Chapter 9. The anatomy of a phantom. The cavernous silence of the railway tunnel was broken only by the engineer's ragged, agonizing groans. Sherlock Holmes, still clad in the grimy vestments of a common navvy, stood over his captive with a clinical detachment that bordered on the chilling. He kicked the fallen revolver further into the shadows and pressed the heavy iron wrench against the man's throat, pinned firmly against a timber support. "I believe you have something of mine, Herr Adler," Holmes rasped, his voice shedding the thick East End accent for its natural, incisive clip. The note was a masterful forgery, I grant you. The slant of the W and the tremor in the H were captured with remarkable fidelity. However, you made the fatal error of using a quill with a split nib. I haven't used such an instrument since my university days. I scrambled to my feet, my heart still hammering against my ribs, and hurried to Vance's side. The poor archivist was hyperventilating, his eyes rolled back in terror. "Holmes," I cried, the relief washing over me like a physical wave. "You were here all along. You didn't go to Paddington." "I am disappointed in you, Watson," Holmes remarked, though his eyes never left the engineer's face. "Did you truly think I would leave our guest and my dearest friend unguarded while I chased a series of conveniently placed breadcrumbs? I spotted this gentleman's decoy, a hired ruffian in an auburn wig boarding a train at Baker Street Station hours ago. I allowed him to lead Lestrade on a merry chase while I doubled back to the square to wait for the real architect of this tragedy. The engineer, his auburn beard now askew and his dark spectacles shattered, spat a mouthful of blood into the mud. You are a devil, Holmes. How did you know I would come here? Logic, Adler. Cold, mathematical logic, Holmes replied. He reached out and, with a sudden, sharp yank, tore the auburn beard from the man's face. I gasped. Beneath the theatrical hair was a face I recognized, though it was leaner, harder, and devoid of the youthful arrogance I had seen earlier that day. "Percival St. Clair," I exclaimed. "But Lestrade arrested him. He is in a cell at Scotland Yard." "Lestrade arrested the real Percival St. Clair," Holmes corrected, a grim smile touching his lips. "The man before us is a master of mimicry and mechanical precision. He is, if I am not mistaken, Friedrich Adler, a disgraced Swiss engineer and a noted specialist in impossible security system. He has been living in the Blackwood attic for months, masquerading as the Earl's nephew when the true Percival was away at his club or his country estate." Adler let out a low, guttural laugh. The old man was half blind. Obsessed with his stones, it was child's play to step into the nephew's shoes. The staff saw what they expected to see, and the debt. I created that ledger myself to give the police the motive they craved. "And the sapphire?" I asked. "You killed for a piece of glass." "A mistake," Adler snarled, his composure finally fracturing. "The Earl played me for a fool. He spoke of the sapphire as if it were his soul. I spent weeks measuring that vault, designing the pneumatic delay timer, casting the key mold from the marzipan impression, all for a bit of Bristol blue." Holmes eased the pressure of the wrench, but kept his revolver leveled. "The murder, however, was no mistake. You realized that as long as Julian Vance lived, there was a witness who might eventually notice the subtle discrepancies in Percival's behavior. You struck him down, killed the Earl, and used your mechanical timer to lock the door behind you. You then escaped through the ventilation shaft, which you had widened from the outside during your survey, and merged back into the household as the grieving nephew." "But the knife at Baker Street," I prompted. "Why, risk coming to our door." "Desperation," Holmes said. He knew I was closing in. He needed to eliminate Vance and frame us in the process. The blood-stained note was his final gambit to bring the witness to a place where a tunnel collapse could be easily arranged. A distant whistle echoed through the tunnel, the sharp, rhythmic blast of a police. "Whistle, Lestrade," Holmes remarked, checked his pocket watch with his free hand. "Precisely 4 minutes late, as usual. I sent a second, irregular, to the yard, once I saw you enter the shaft, Watson. I felt the inspector deserved to at least witness the arrest, even if he couldn't conceive of the crime." Within moments, the tunnel was flooded with the light of a dozen lanterns, as Lestrade of constables swarmed the excavation site. The inspector looked bewildered, his gaze darting from the soot-stained Holmes to the bruised and battered nephew, pinned against the timber. "What is this, Holmes?" Lestrade demanded, breathless. "We have St. Clair in the cells. Who is this man?" "This, Lestrade, is your murderer," Holmes said, stepping back and allowing the constables to move in with the irons. "I suggest you check the genuine Mr. St. Clair's right forearm. You will find it bears no scar. This man, however, has a very distinct burn from a soldering iron, a souvenir from his time constructing the very timer that impossibly locked that vault door." As Adler was led away in chains, cursing in a mixture of German and English, Holmes turned to me. He looked exhausted, the suit on his face streaked with sweat, but his eyes were alight with the fire of a completed puzzle. "Come, Watson, the damp in this hole is doing nothing for your old wound, and I believe Mrs. Hudson may have left some cold partridge in the larder. We have one final chapter to close in this sordid business of the Anubis sapphire." "But the jewel, Holmes," I said as we climbed toward the surface. "Where is the real one?" "The real one, Watson, is exactly where it has been for 20 years, Holmes replied enigmatically as we stepped back into the foggy Berkeley Square. "And tomorrow we shall see it return to its rightful and far more secure resting place." Chapter 10. The final accounting, the following morning, broke with a rare, pale sun struggling through the London mist, casting long, watery shadows across the breakfast table at 221 Baker Street. The shattered window in my bedroom had been boarded up, and the air in the sitting room was no longer thick with the scent of marzipan or chemical fumes. Instead, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and grilled kidneys filled the air, a testament to Mrs. Hudson's resilience in the face of our chaotic household. Sherlock Holmes sat in his dressing gown, his long, thin legs stretched toward the fire. He was, meticulously, cleaning the soot from beneath his fingernails with a pocket-knife, his expression one of serene contentment. Julian Vance, looking significantly more robust after a night of undisturbed sleep and a hearty meal, sat opposite him, nursing a cup of tea. "It is still difficult to fathom," Vance murmured, shaking his head. "To think that the man I served for years was being shadowed by a double in his own home, Friedrich Adler. I remember now, he often wore a high collar, even in the heat of the vault, to hide a lack of a specific birthmark, perhaps. Or perhaps to hide the tension in his throat when he spoke to you, Mr. Vance," Holmes remarked, snapping his knife shut. "Mimicry is an exhausting art. Adler was a brilliant engineer, but a mediocre actor. He relied on the Earl's failing eyesight and your own preoccupation with the archives. Had you looked at him with the clinical eye of my friend Watson, you might have noted that his earlobes were attached, whereas the true Percival St. Clair possesses the detached lobes common to the Blackwood lineage. A detail I missed entirely," I admitted, pouring myself more coffee. "But Holmes, the matter of the Anubis sapphire remains. If the stone Adler stole was a Bristol glass decoy, where is the true gem? You mentioned the Bank of England, but surely Adler would have checked there if he had been living as the nephew." Holmes smiled, that thin, enigmatic curve of the lips. "Adler did check, Watson. He spent weeks scouring the Earl's private papers in the guise of the nephew. He found records of a safety deposit box. But when he attempted to access it, he discovered the Earl had closed the account 3 years ago. It drove him to the brink of madness, which is why he became convinced the sapphire was back in the vault." "Then where is it?" Vance asked, leaning forward. Holmes rose and walked over to the corner of the room, where a large, iron-bound crate sat one of the many Egyptian artifacts Vance had brought with him from the manor for safekeeping during the investigation. Holmes tapped the lid of a particularly weather-beaten canopic jar, its limestone surface carved into the likeness of a jackal's head. "The Earl was a man of profound irony, Mr. Vance," Holmes explained. "He knew that a vault, no matter how reinforced, is a magnet for thieves. He understood that the best way to hide a leaf is in a forest. Watson, if you would be so kind as to hand me that heavy brass poker." I did, as requested, with a sudden, forceful strike. Holmes shattered the base of the limestone jar. As the fragments clattered to the floor, a stream of ancient, grey sand poured out. And there, nestled within the dust of centuries, rolled a stone of such breathtaking, hypnotic blue that it seemed to capture the very essence of the morning sky. "The Anubis sapphire," I whispered. It was an enormous, uncut kabokon, glowing with an inner fire that made the Bristol glass look like a common marble. "The Earl didn't put it in a bank," Holmes said, picking up the jewel and holding it to the light. "He placed it inside a minor artifact that he knew even a seasoned thief would find unremarkable. He then placed that artifact in plain sight within the vault. Adler was so obsessed with the pedestal and the security of the door that he never thought to look inside the very objects he was supposed to be archiving." Vance stared at the stone, tears welling in his eyes. "He trusted me to move this crate, Mr. Holmes. He knew that if anything happened to him, I would ensure his collection reached the British Museum. Even in his paranoia, he left a trail for the honest man." "A rare trait in this city," Holmes remarked. The sound of wheels on the cobblestones announced the arrival of a carriage. A few moments later, Inspector Lestrade entered the room, looking remarkably sheepish. He held a copy of the Gazette, the headlines loudly proclaiming the capture of the subterranean assassin. "The genuine Saint Clair has been released," Holmes, Lestrade said, clearing his throat. "He's a bit rattled, but he's confirmed everything. Adler had been intercepting his mail and mimicking his signature for months. We found the master molds for the key and the pneumatic timer in a false bottom of the nephew's trunk." "And the charge?" I asked. "Capital murder, attempted murder of a witness, and grand larceny," Lestrade replied grimly. "The hangman will have a busy morning come next month. I suppose I owe you an apology, Holmes. I went for the easy mark." "You went for the obvious, Lestrade." "It is a common human failing," Holmes said, handing the sapphire to the inspector. "Pray, see this delivered to the curators at the British Museum under a heavy guard. Mr. Vance here will accompany you to verify the transfer." As the room cleared and the house fell into its accustomed quiet, Holmes returned to his armchair. He took up his pipe, filling it with the pungent black shag tobacco he favoured when a case was concluded. "A satisfactory conclusion, Watson," he said, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. "The innocent is vindicated, the guilty is caught, and a piece of history is preserved. What more could a man ask for? Perhaps a bit of credit in the newspapers." I suggested with a grin. Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "The work is its own reward. Besides, if the public knew how much of my time was spent analyzing marzipan and mud, they would lose their respect for the consulting detective. No, Watson, you shall tell the story in your own fashion, with all the drama and suspense your readers crave." He leaned back, closing his eyes. "But for now, I find myself dreadfully bored again. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of the peculiar advertisement in this morning's Times regarding a missing canary and a retired colonel in Kensington?" I smiled, opening the paper. The fog was lifting, the sun was shining, and in the heart of London, the great detective was ready for the next move in the endless game of shadows. Chapter 11. The echo of the jackal, the resolution of the Blackwood case, brought a temporary calm to our quarters. Yet for Sherlock Holmes, the conclusion of a mystery was often followed by a period of intense, almost brooding reflection. while the Anubis sapphire sat safely behind the reinforced glass of the British Museum, and Friedrich Adler awaited his date with the hangman, Holmes remained tethered to the finer details of the impossible vault. It was 2 days after Adler's arrest. The London fog had returned with a vengeance, thick and smelling of coal smoke, pressing against the windows of 221 Ib. Holmes was not at his chemical bench, nor was he scraping away at his violin. Instead, he was hunched over a series of technical blueprints he had borrowed from the railway excavation office, tracing the subterranean ley lines of Mayfair with a long, trembling finger. "There is a lingering disharmony, Watson," he said, his voice a low rasp. I looked up from the latest medical journal. Disharmony. The man is caught. Holmes. The mechanics are explained. Even Lestrade is satisfied, which is a miracle in itself. Lestrade is satisfied because he has a body for the gallows and a jewel for the headlines. Holmes snapped, straightening his back. But consider the timing. Adler spent months in that house. He calculated the pneumatic delay to the second. He mimicked the nephew with terrifying precision. Why, then, did he strike so clumsily? At Baker Street, why use a Moorish throwing knife a weapon so distinct? It practically shouted his continental origins. Desperation, I suggested. You said so yourself in the tunnel. Desperation is the parent of many errors. But Adler was a man of cold, Germanic stone. He didn't just want Vanstead. He wanted the sapphire. If he believed the sapphire he took was fake, which he clearly did, why did he not return to the vault to search again before we arrived? Perhaps he feared the police. Presence? Holmes shook his head. His eyes narrowed. He was the nephew, Watson. He had every right to be in that house. He could have searched for his uncle's missing documents and found the real stone at his leisure. Instead, he fled to a muddy hole in Berkeley Square and attempted a theatrical assassination. He stood up and began to pace the rug, his dressing gown fluttering behind him like the wings of a giant bat. No, Watson, there is a missing chord in this symphony. Adler was a technician, a tool, but the intellect that prompted him to strike precisely when he did, that remains in the shadows. A soft knock at the door interrupted his pacing. Mrs. Hudson entered, looking uncharacteristically somber. She held a small cedar wood box wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a coarse twine. This was left at the door just now. Mr. Holmes, she said. A young lad brought it. He said it was for the gentleman who likes puzzles. Holmes snatched the box with a sharp intake of breath. He carried it to the table, his movements cautious, almost reverent. He sniffed the wood, then shook it gently near his ear. No ticking, Watson, not a bomb, but the weight. It is uneven. He cut the twine with his pocket knife and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single exquisite object. A jackal's head carved from the same limestone as the canopic jar Holmes had shattered the morning before. It was a perfect replica, save for one detail. Where the eyes of the jackal should have been, there were 2 small empty sockets. Pinned to the velvet was a small cream-colored card. On it, in a delicate, slanted hand that bore no resemblance to Adler's or Sainty, Clare's were written 4 words: "Check the secondary bolt." Holmes's face went pale. Without a word, he grabbed his heavy ulster and his deerstalker. "Watson, your service revolver. We are going back to Blackwood Manor. At this hour. The house is a crime scene, Holmes." Matimon. Precisely, and I have been a fool of the first water. The drive to Mayfair was a blur of shadows. Holmes remained silent, his jaw set in a grim line. When we arrived at the darkened manor, the police tape had been torn by the wind. We bypassed the sleeping constable at the gate, a simple matter for Holmes, and descended once more into the subterranean silence of the vault. The room felt colder now, the scent of death replaced by the smell of damp stone. Holmes ignored the empty pedestals, and went straight to the heavy steel door. He knelt, not at the lock he had studied so intensely, but at the very base of the frame, where the heavy secondary bolts engaged with the granite floor. "Bring the lantern closer, Watson," he commanded. As the light hit the floor, I saw what he had missed. In the deep recess where the steel bolt slid into the stone, there was a tiny, glinting protrusion. Holmes reached in with a pair of long-nosed pliers and withdrew a small, silver cylinder, no larger than a thimble. He unscrewed the cap. Inside was a tiny rolled-up slip of parchment. "What is it?" I whispered. Holmes unrolled the paper. It was a list of names, dates, and amounts. Vast sums of money transferred from the Earl of Blackwood's accounts to a series of anonymous holdings in Switzerland. At the bottom of the list was a signature that made Holmes's hand tremble. "Adler was not a thief, Watson," Holmes said, his voice hollow. "He was an auditor. These are the records of the Earl's involvement in a massive international arms smuggling ring. The Anubis sapphire was never the prize. It was the decoy the Earl used to distract the world while he moved millions in blood money." "But who sent the box?" I asked, staring at the limestone jackal. Holmes looked up at the darkened ceiling, his gaze piercing the shadows. "The person who truly won this game, Watson. The person who allowed Adler to be caught, allowed the sapphire to be found, and used me to clear the board so they could vanish with the real wealth." He tucked the parchment into his pocket. "Adler was a pawn. The Earl was a king who turned traitor, and we, my dear Watson, have been the knights protecting a ghost." As we climbed out of the vault for the final time, I looked back. The empty room seemed to mock us. The mystery of the Anubis sapphire was solved, but a far darker, more expansive web had just been revealed, one that Holmes knew, with a chilling certainty, he would be untangling for years to come. "The case is closed, Watson," Holmes said, as we stepped into the freezing night. "But the war has only just begun." Chapter 12. The Philosophy of the Fog. The return to Baker Street was conducted in a silence so profound it seemed to weigh heavier than the yellow vapor pressing against the windows of our hansom. Holmes sat as still as a statue carved from basalt, the silver cylinder clutched in his long, thin fingers. The revelation in the vault that the eccentric Earl of Blackwood was no mere collector, but a financier of international strife, had cast a cold, grey light over our hard-won victory. Upon entering our sitting room, Holmes did not seek his pipe or his violin. Instead, he moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of sherry, handing one to me with a hand that was uncharacteristically steady. "To the illusions of the Victorian age, Watson," he said, his voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. "We chase the flash of a sapphire while the foundations of empires are traded in the dark." I took a long draught of the wine, feeling its warmth spread through my chest. "The ledger, Holmes, what will you do with it? If the Earl was indeed funding such atrocities, the authorities must be informed." Holmes walked to the fireplace, leaning his forehead against the cool marble of the mantelpiece. "The authorities, Watson. Lestrade, the Home Office. Look at the names on that parchment again. These are not merely the names of arms dealers. They are the names of men who sit in the very drawing rooms we frequent. To release this now would not bring justice. It would bring a chaos that London is not yet prepared to weather." He turned, the firelight dancing in his deep-set eyes. "The person who sent us that box knew this. They did not want the police to have this information. They wanted me to have it. It was a calculated move, a chess player, sacrificing a knight to ensure the king remains in check. But who, Holmes, who could possibly maneuver with such cold-blooded precision?" Holmes reached into the pocket of his dressing gown and withdrew the small cream-colored card from the jackal's head box. He held it close to the lamp, examining the slanted script one final time. "A mind that equals my own, Watson, perhaps one that exceeds it in its lack of human sentiment. I have sensed a shadow moving behind the curtain of several cases this year, a central intelligence that threads through the disparate crimes of this city like a weaver through a loom." He moved to his desk and opened a small private drawer, depositing the silver cylinder and the parchment inside. He locked it with a double turn of a golden key. For now, it remains our secret, a weapon held in reserve for the day when the weaver steps into the light. Julian Vance is safe, the nephew is unmasked, and the public has their sapphire. We have fulfilled our contract with society, even if the truth is far grimmer than the legend. I watched him as he finally reached for his briar pipe, the tension in his shoulders beginning to ebb, and the jackal's head, Holmes, the one with the empty eyes. Holmes picked up the limestone carving from the table, turning it over in his hands. A memento mori, Watson, a reminder that in the hunt for truth we often find only the bones of a larger beast. It shall sit upon my mantle as a warning against complacency. He settled into his armchair, the familiar blue shroud of tobacco smoke soon beginning to swirl about his head. The clock on the mantel ticked rhythmically, counting down the final hours of a case that had begun with a terrified archivist and ended with a global conspiracy. "You look tired, old friend," Holmes said softly, his gaze softening as it rested upon me. "The tunnels of Mayfair have taken their toll. Go to bed. Tomorrow, the sun may actually manage to pierce this wretched fog, and there will be new problems to solve, hopefully ones involving nothing more sinister than a stolen horse or a wayward." "Governess, and you, Holmes?" I asked, rising and stretching my aching limbs. "Will you rest?" "In a moment, Watson, in a moment." I find myself reflecting on a remark made by a certain philosopher. He said that once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But he neglected to mention that the truth is often a bitter pill to swallow. I paused at the door of my bedroom, looking back at the silhouette of the man who was both the most brilliant and the most lonely soul I had ever known. He was already staring back into the embers of the fire, his mind likely miles away, untangling threads that I could scarcely perceive. "Good night, Holmes," I said. "Good night, Watson." As I closed my door, I heard the first faint, haunting notes of his violin. It was not a discordant scrape this time, but a slow, melancholic air, a lament for the Earl, for Adler, and perhaps for the innocence of an age that was rapidly slipping away into the shadows of a new and more dangerous century. The case of the strange guest of Baker Street was over. But as I lay in the dark, listening to the music and the muffled sounds of the London night, I knew that, for Sherlock Holmes, the game was never truly finished. It was merely a pause between the movements of a grand, terrible symphony, and I, his faithful chronicler, would be there to record every note.